Welcome to Slumberverse! Oh gee, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. On the night the wind forgot to move, the station returned like a held breath joining the body again. Fog pooled along the rails, silvering the wood, softening every edge to a hush. The clock above the platform did not tick. It listened. Lamps wore faint halos, and in their patient glow the empty benches looked like the ribs of some sleeping creature. The air itself felt spun from silver thread, thick as cream and twice as quiet, wrapping around the world like a gentle shawl. Ansa knew better than to close her eyes when the mist came calling. She had been keeper of this place for 17 years, a woman who carried cardamom pods in her pocket and the smell of rain in the hem of her coat. Her hair, the color of dried lavender, was caught in its usual loose bun, and her apron held the perpetual scent of earth after soft rain. She had learned long ago that not all stations are for arrivals and departures. Some are for remembering, some are for rescuing what would be lost if left alone. The platform existed only on nights like these, when the air held its breath and the world grew soft around the edges. During daylight hours, there was nothing but an empty field where wildflowers nodded and rabbits made their homes. But when the fog came thick and the wind went still, the old station materialized like a thought becoming real, its weathered timber and forgotten tracks emerging from the space between sleeping and waking. She pulled her wool coat closer and stepped into the silver-white world, her boots finding the familiar path by memory alone. The rails were humming something she had never heard before, not quite a lullaby, not quite a prayer, but something that made her chest feel warm and her eyes want to close. It was a sound so faint, it might have been the distant thrum of the earth, a single, sustained note that resonated deep within her bones. The platform bench came into view first, its wooden slats dark with moisture, smoothed by countless unseen departures. Then she saw the bundle, small and still, wrapped in what looked like starlight woven into cloth. Her heart did a little skip, the way it always did when the night offered something precious and fragile. She approached slowly, her footsteps muffled by the fog, and knelt beside the bench. It was a baby, a tiny thing, maybe 3 months old, sleeping so peacefully that for a moment Ansa wondered if she was dreaming. The child's breath came in the softest puffs, barely disturbing the silver air around his face. His hair was dark as river stones, and his skin held that particular glow that newborns carry, as if they still remember where they came from. He had a scattering of freckles like distant stars across his nose, and when his eyes fluttered briefly open, they were the color of deep water on a cloudy day, wise and ancient in that startling way that babies sometimes are. But it was what he held in his small fist that made Ansa's breath catch. A bottle, no bigger than her thumb, filled with light that moved like liquid starshine. The light pulsed gently, keeping time with the baby's heartbeat, and it hummed. That same low, sweet note the rails had been singing. The bottle was made of glass so fine it seemed woven from moonlight itself, and the glow within was not bright or startling, but warm and alive, like captured fireflies or the first star of evening. It was the kind of light that makes shadows softer, that promises warmth without heat. A beacon born of quiet, enduring magic. She reached out with careful fingers and touched the baby's cheek. His skin was warm, real, completely alive. He stirred slightly at her touch, making a small sound that was not quite a coo, and his fingers loosened slightly around the bottle of light. The humming grew softer, more like a contented sigh, and Ansa felt something shift in the air around them. Ilya, she said suddenly, the name arriving in her mouth like it had been waiting there all along. The word felt like a true coat for a new day, meaning light in the old tongue, fitting perfectly with the soft glow he brought with him. There were no marks, no notes, no signs of a hurried departure or desperate plea. Just the baby, the light, and the profound silence of the platform. The fog swirled around them both, and for just a moment Ansa thought she heard something like an answer. Not words exactly, but a feeling that wrapped around her shoulders like her grandmother's shawl. A feeling that said he had come from the place where wishes become real, from the moment when someone loves hard enough to let go. She gathered the child into her arms, marveling at how perfectly he fit there, as if her arms had been shaped for exactly this purpose. The bottle of light remained clutched in his tiny hand, its glow steady and sure. As she stood, the fog began to thin at the edges, and she knew the platform would fade soon, returning to wherever such places go when morning comes. The walk back to her cottage felt different with the baby in her arms. The fog parted before them like curtains, and the path seemed smoother, as if the night itself was helping to carry them home. Ansa found herself humming along with the bottle's gentle song, a melody that seemed to know all the lullabies she had ever heard, and several she had not. By the time they reached her front door, the fog had lifted entirely, leaving only the scent of rain-washed air and the memory of magic. She paused on her threshold, looking down at the sleeping child. In the porch light, the bottle's glow was even more beautiful, pulsing with ancient, wordless wisdom. Inside her small, warm kitchen, she settled into her rocking chair by the window. Outside, the world looked perfectly ordinary again. No platform, no rails, no hint of the magic that had just unfolded. But in her arms, Ilya stirred and made that small, contented sound again, and the bottle hummed its quiet song. The night settled around them like a blessing, and somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the rails singing one last note of gratitude before falling silent, until the next windless evening came calling. This quiet, almost dreamlike beginning set the tone for everything that would follow, imbuing his very existence with magic, interwoven with the mundane. A life lived forever on the soft edge between what was seen and what was merely felt. Morning found them as naturally as breath finds the body after sleep. The fog had lifted, but its gentleness remained woven into the cottage walls, settling into the corners where dust motes danced in early light. Ansa placed the bottle of starlight on the kitchen windowsill, where it could catch both sunrise and moonbeam, and immediately the room felt more complete, as if it had been waiting all along for this particular glow. The bottle hummed its single sweet note, barely audible, threading itself through the morning sounds of kettle and birdsong. It was the windows that changed first. Ansa had always known they were different, these old panes with their wavy glass that made the garden look like a watercolor painting. But with Ilya in the house, they began to listen in ways that surprised even her. On the third morning after his arrival, Mrs. Holloway from down the hill knocked to borrow sugar, carrying her grief like an overstuffed satchel. The moment she stepped into the kitchen, the window above the sink gave a soft, deliberate creak and swung open just an inch. "I haven't been sleeping well," Mrs. Holloway said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if the fresh air had loosened them. "Ever since Tom passed, the house feels too quiet. I keep setting two places at the table." Her voice cracked, and the window opened another inch, letting in the scent of honeysuckle and morning dew. Ansa poured tea without speaking, following the wisdom her grandmother had taught her. Tea before advice, comfort before questions. Ilya, barely walking then, toddled over with his bottle clutched in one small fist. He looked up at Mrs. Holloway with those deep water eyes and began to hum, a sound so soft it might have been the house settling. But something in the air shifted, the sharp edges of grief smoothing into something more bearable, and Mrs. Holloway's shoulders dropped as if she'd set down an invisible burden. "The windows know when someone needs to speak truth," Ansa told Ilya later as she rocked him to sleep. "And you, little one, you help them listen." The bottle pulsed gently in response, and she took that as agreement. As Ilya grew from toddler to small boy, his gift revealed itself in layers, like morning mist clearing to show the landscape beneath. When the baker's apprentice came by with scraped palms and tears of frustration, Ilya's quiet hum seemed to gather the sharp threads of anger from the air, transforming them into something softer. When old Mr. Chen arrived with his usual complaints about the neighbor's dog, Ilya would start humming while playing with his wooden blocks, and somehow the complaints would melt into stories about the dog he'd loved as a child. Ansa watched and learned alongside him, discovering that harsh words left traces in the air like grey spider webs, thin threads that caught the light wrong and made the room feel smaller. Ilya seemed to see them too, though he never said so directly. Instead, he would breathe deeply as if inhaling the greyness, then hum it back out in a different key, releasing it through the listening windows where it would dissolve into the patient sky. She taught him the craft of kindness as naturally as teaching him to walk. "Blankets before questions," she would say, wrapping a shawl around someone's shoulders before asking what brought them to the door. She showed him how to make space for another person's pain without trying to fix it immediately, how to listen with his whole body, how to understand that sometimes the greatest gift was simply being witnessed. The midnight sandwiches began by accident. A woman knocked past 11 one night, travel-worn and clutching a carpet bag like it held everything she owned. Ansa opened the door because that's what you do when someone arrives carrying the weight of the world. And Ilya, who had been sleeping by the kitchen fire, sat up and pointed to the bread with the certainty that only children possess. While Ansa settled the woman by the fire, 4-year-old Ilya climbed onto his little stool and began what would become his signature offering. Thick slices of bread toasted until golden, butter spread while still soft enough to melt, a thin layer of honey, sometimes jam if the season was right. Simple food, but made with the kind of attention that says you matter. You are welcome here, you are safe. The woman ate 3 sandwiches and cried quietly into her tea while telling them about the husband who had raised his hand once too often, about the long walk to her sister's house, about the fear that she was making a mistake. Ilya sat nearby, humming under his breath, and somehow the woman's tears seemed to wash something clean instead of just wearing her down. After that, word spread in the way good news travels, quietly and surely. They came with broken hearts and empty stomachs, with secrets too heavy to carry alone, and dreams too fragile to speak aloud. The house responded by becoming more itself, the windows growing more sensitive, the hearth burning steadier, even the floorboards creaking more gently to announce visitors without startling them. By the time Ilya was 5, he could make a perfect midnight sandwich and pour tea without spilling. The bottle of light had grown slightly dimmer over the years, as if its glow was being shared with everything around it. But on the quietest nights, when someone particularly broken found their way to the door, it would pulse brighter, remembering its original purpose. The cottage had become exactly what it was meant to be, a place where people could set down their burdens and remember what it felt like to breathe. The seasons turned as gently as pages in a well-loved book, and with them, Ilya grew into his gift the way morning light grows into day. By his 6th summer, the cottage had settled into its rhythm of midnight visitors and listening windows, and the bottle of starlight had found its permanent home on the sill, pulsing with the steady contentment of something finally where it belonged. But it was during those long, drowsy afternoons when no one knocked, and the house breathed quietly around them, that Ilya began to discover the deeper layers of his unusual world. He was sitting in the apple tree's lowest branch, legs swinging in the dappled shade, when he first realized the clouds had flavors. It began as curiosity, the way a child might wonder what snow tastes like or whether flowers have different songs. He tilted his head back, mouth slightly open to the sky, and let his awareness drift upward like a lazy balloon. The high white clouds that looked like sheep scattered across blue pasture tasted clean and soft, exactly like fresh linen hung on the line to dry in summer wind. There was something comforting about that flavor, something that reminded him of safety and home. The grey clouds gathering over the western hills carried entirely different notes. They tasted of distant lemons and the metallic tang of pennies, sharp and promising, with an undertone that made his teeth ache pleasantly. Storm clouds, when they rolled in thick and dark, brought flavors of iron and old wood, wild and electric, like the air just before lightning decides where to land. Each cloud formation had its own signature, its own story written in taste and texture that only he seemed able to read. But it wasn't just the sky that spoke to him in flavors. As his sensitivity deepened, Ilya began to notice that human emotions left traces too, visible threads that lingered in the air long after the feelings had passed. Harsh words spoken in anger or frustration didn't simply dissolve into nothing. They hung like grey spider silk in corners, clung to the edges of doorframes, swirled around people's shoulders like thin smoke. These threads had their own bitter taste, sharp and stale, making rooms feel smaller and air feel thick. The first time he consciously gathered these grey threads, it was almost by accident. A travelling peddler had argued with Ansa over the price of buttons, his voice growing sharper with each exchange, until the very air seemed to crackle with irritation. After he left, Ilya noticed the kitchen felt different, as if the walls had drawn closer together. Grey wisps drifted near the ceiling like fog that had forgotten how to rain. Without thinking, he began to hum his quiet song, the one that seemed to live in his chest, without needing to be learned. As he hummed, he breathed deeply, drawing the grey threads into himself where they dissolved into something softer, Then he exhaled gently through the open window, releasing them skyward where they scattered among the patient clouds. The kitchen immediately felt larger, brighter, as if someone had opened curtains he hadn't noticed were closed. Ansa watched this process with the careful attention she gave to all important things. She said nothing at first, but he caught her studying him as he worked, her cardamom-scented presence a steady comfort. It was only after he had been practicing this quiet cleaning for several weeks that she finally spoke. They were sitting together on the front steps, watching the sun paint the hills gold and amber, when she reached over and touched his hair with fingers that smelled of bread dough and kindness. "You have a gift for seeing what others leave behind," she said, her voice carrying the weight of gentle wisdom. "And it's good to clear the air, to make breathing easier for everyone who comes after." Ilya looked up at her, his deep water eyes serious in the fading light. "The grey bits make everything feel heavy," he said simply. "I just send them back to the sky where they belong." Ansa nodded, but her expression grew thoughtful. "Yes, you do. But remember this, little one." She paused, choosing her words like careful stitches in important fabric. "Be careful with what people carry. Sometimes their heaviness is what holds them together. Sometimes the bitterness is the only thing that feels real to them." He didn't fully understand her warning then. How could he? To his young perception, the world divided neatly into light and shadow, comfort and discomfort, clean air and grey threads that needed clearing. His instinct was always to lighten, to heal, to make room for easier breathing. But he nodded solemnly, storing her words away like seeds that would sprout understanding later. As autumn deepened and the visitors continued their gentle parade through the cottage, Ilya practiced his craft with growing subtlety. He learned to taste the difference between fresh grief and old sorrow, between anger that needed expression and rage that had curdled into something toxic. He discovered that some grey threads were meant to be cleared completely, while others needed only their sharpest edges softened, leaving the core intact so people could learn from what they carried. The bottle of starlight seemed to approve of his growing wisdom, pulsing brighter when he showed restraint, dimmer when he reached too far. On quiet evenings, when the house settled around them like a contented cat, Ansa would tell him stories of other gifts, other ways of helping, that didn't involve taking anything away but simply being present, simply witnessing, simply holding space for whatever needed to be held. And so Ilya learned to taste the sky and clean the air, but more importantly, he learned to listen to the wisdom that whispered between breaths, the knowledge that some things were meant to be transformed rather than removed, tended rather than eliminated. The grey threads still called to him, but now he approached them with the patience of someone who understood that healing was not always about making things disappear, but sometimes about helping them find their proper place in the larger pattern of living. The spring that followed brought more than wildflowers and longer days. It carried with it the kind of restless energy that makes young hearts want to wander, to follow paths they've never walked and listen to songs they've never heard. Ilya, now 8 and growing into his gift like a tree grows into its bark, found himself drawn more often to the river that wound through the valley below Ansa's cottage. The water there moved with a different rhythm than the streams that bordered their garden, deeper and more purposeful, carrying stories from places he could only imagine. It was on one of these wandering afternoons, when the air hung sweet with clover, and the grey threads from the morning's visitors had long since dissolved into the patient sky, that he first heard the river's sleep song. He had been sitting on a sun-warmed stone, letting his feet dangle in the cool current when the sound reached him. Not quite humming, not quite singing, but something that lived in the space between, rising from the water itself like mist made audible. The melody was ancient and unhurried, the kind of lullaby that rivers sing to their banks when no one is listening, a sound that made his chest feel warm and his eyelids want to close. He was so absorbed in this new music that he almost missed the figure downstream, crouched beside what looked like the remains of a small boat. The boy was perhaps his own age, with hair the color of autumn wheat and clothes that carried the particular rumpled quality of someone who had been traveling by water. In his hands was a splintered oar, its wood split lengthwise as if it had argued with something much stronger, and lost gracefully. Ilya approached quietly, the way Ansa had taught him to approach all unexpected encounters, with curiosity rather than urgency. As he drew closer, he could see that the boy was working with focused determination, trying to bind the broken oar with strips of cloth torn from what might once have been a shirt. His movements were economical, practiced, as if mending broken things was a skill he'd learned by necessity rather than choice. "The river's singing," Ilya said softly, settling onto a nearby stone without invitation, but also without intrusion. The boy looked up, and his eyes were the color of moss after rain, bright with intelligence and something that might have been relief. "You can hear it too," he said, and his voice carried the musical quality of someone who had spent long hours in conversation with water. "Most people can't. They think it's just the sound of current over stones, but it's more than that, isn't it?" Ilya nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared breath. "It's sleepy," he said. "Like the river is humming itself a lullaby." "Exactly." The boy grinned, and his smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds, sudden and transformative. "I'm Rowan, and this," he held up the broken oar with rueful affection, "used to be my boat's best friend until we met a tree branch that was feeling particularly stubborn." They sat together as the afternoon grew long and golden, sharing the comfortable silence that sometimes forms between kindred spirits. Rowan told him about following the river from its source in the distant mountains, about sleeping under stars and waking to find deer drinking quietly beside his makeshift camp. His laughter bubbled up like spring water, bright and irrepressible, and Ilya found himself grinning without quite knowing why, the way children do when they encounter someone who speaks their particular dialect of wonder. When the sun began to paint the sky in shades of apricot and rose, Ilya invited Rowan home with the easy generosity that Ansa had modeled for him. They walked up the hill path together, Rowan still carrying his broken oar like a faithful companion, and Ilya carrying the memory of the river's sleep song humming in his chest. Ansa greeted them at the door, with the knowing smile she reserved for arrivals that felt like destiny rather than coincidence. She had prepared tea and fresh bread without being asked, recognizing with the wisdom that comes from years of welcoming strangers that some encounters are meant to become longer stories. Over supper, Rowan shared tales of his river journey, speaking of markets that appeared only during thunderstorms and paths that remembered every footstep they'd ever held. But it was later, as they sat by the kitchen fire with cups of warm milk and honey, that the deeper magic revealed itself. Rowan began to hum quietly, a melody that wove itself perfectly with the river's distant sleep song, and Ilya found his own voice joining in, his gift for harmony expanding to include this new friendship. The sound they made together was neither urgent nor healing, but simply present, a musical conversation that needed no words. That night, Ansa prepared the small guest room with fresh linens and a window that looked toward the river. As the house settled into its familiar evening rhythm, Ilya lay in his narrow bed, listening to the soft sounds of someone else breathing in the next room. It was a new kind of music, this gentle evidence of companionship, and it made the cottage feel more complete than it ever had with just him and Ansa. Through the thin walls, he could hear Rowan humming quietly to himself, the same melody they had shared by the fire, and he understood something new about friendship. This wasn't like the visitors who came seeking comfort or healing, carrying their grey threads and heavy hearts. This was different, clean and uncomplicated, asking nothing of his gift except the simple pleasure of harmony. Rowan didn't need his hurts cleared away or his rough edges smoothed. He was whole exactly as he was, stubborn laughter and broken oars and all. In the days that followed, they fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. They would spend mornings helping Ansa with the cottage's gentle routines, then wander down to the river, where they built boats from fallen doors they found washed up among the reeds. These craft were often clumsy, sometimes sank on their maiden voyages, but the act of building them together, of shaping wood and dreaming of journeys, was the true vessel of their bond. They shared thick slices of bread slathered with butter and honey, eaten under the vast star-strewn canvas of the night sky. They swapped lullabies, not just the ones Ansa had taught Ilya, but new ones Rowan remembered from his travels, songs about lonely mountains and whispering winds, about the steadfastness of the moon and the patience of the earth. Their voices, one soft and humming, the other a little rough but true, intertwined like river currents finding their way to the same sea. This was Ilya's first taste of unconditional companionship, a bond that needed no explanation, no healing, no gentle clearing of difficult emotions. It simply existed, like the river's sleep song, like the patient turning of seasons, like the quiet breath of night settling over the cottage. Their friendship took root not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the shared language of water sounds and comfortable silences, in the unhurried rhythm of two boys sitting side by side, promising nothing but their unwavering presence to each other, and in the bottle of starlight on the windowsill, the glow seemed to pulse with quiet approval, recognizing perhaps that some of life's greatest gifts come not from what we can heal or change, but from what we can simply witness and hold, unchanged and perfect exactly as it is. Summer deepened around their friendship, like honey settling into comb, sweet and golden and unhurried. And the days had found their rhythm, with Rowan's presence woven so naturally into the cottage's gentle routines that even the listening windows seemed to creak more softly when he passed beneath them. His mended oar leaned forgotten by the door, replaced by the deeper anchor of belonging that had grown between them like river grass finding its roots. It was on the first truly warm evening of the season, when the air hung thick with the promise of fireflies and the river slowed its breathing to match the drowsy pace of summer, that Ansa looked up from her evening mending with eyes that held familiar mischief. The bottle of starlight pulsed gently on its windowsill, and something in the quality of the light suggested that tonight was different, charged with possibility. "If you follow the moths downstream," she said, setting down her needle with the deliberate care she used for important pronouncements, "and if you walk softly where the old oak grows sideways, you might find something worth seeing. But remember, arrive after the last church bell rings and leave before the first rooster remembers his lines." Rowan's moss-green eyes brightened with recognition. "The night market," he breathed, and Ilya felt something flutter in his chest like wings testing the air. They had heard whispers of such a place, rumors carried by travelers who spoke of stalls that sold rescued dreams, and vendors who bartered in starlight and story. They slipped away as the church bell finished its final, fading note, following a drift of pale moths that gathered above the river grass like scattered moonlight. The path revealed itself gradually, winding between reeds that whispered secrets to the evening breeze, leading them to a hollow where an ancient oak had grown parallel to the earth, its massive trunk creating a natural shelter. The night market unfolded before them like a flower blooming in fast motion, stalls and booths materializing between one heartbeat and the next. Lanterns hung from invisible strings, casting pools of warm golden light that made everything shimmer at the edges of perception. The air itself felt different here, thicker with possibility, scented with cardamom and star anise, and something that might have been the smell of captured moonlight. An old woman with hair like silver smoke tended a stall where rescued dreams hung like soft scarves, each one folded with care and tied with threads of color. Blues for the sea-bound, greens for those who needed rest, gold for courage that had forgotten its name. Nearby, a man with ink-stained fingers offered jars of star salt that glowed faintly in the lamplight, crystals that promised to taste like the moment just before sleep. Ilya discovered that his gift worked differently here, his quiet hum serving as both language and currency. When he approached a vendor, his soft melody would fill the space between them, carrying questions and offers without need for words. The sellers seemed to understand, nodding with the recognition of those who spoke in similar dialects of wonder. At a stall draped in fabric that looked like captured twilight, they found a keeper, with calm shoulders and hands that looked at peace. Bells were arranged on velvet cloth like small moons, some thin as shells, others heavy as pears. "Choose with your listening, not your eyes," the keeper whispered. Ilya closed his eyes and let his awareness drift, feeling for the bell that called to him. His fingers found one no bigger than a walnut, its copper surface worn smooth by touch. When he lifted it, warmth spread through his palm like a creature waking from sleep. "It rings when someone is nearly honest," the keeper explained, their voice gentle as morning mist. "That tender brink where truth leans forward but hasn't yet stepped. Useful if you like to listen for edges." For payment, Ilya offered a promise he knew he could keep, to treat the bell gently and never use it to embarrass. The keeper weighed the promise like a coin, accepted it with a small bow, and wrapped the bell in paper that crinkled like dry leaves. They wandered deeper, past whisper collectors who bottled the things people murmured to themselves when alone, past children who giggled over jars of crystallized laughter, creating endless loops of joy that made everyone nearby smile without knowing why. Rowan traded a river-worn stone for a small wooden boat that promised to carry unspoken wishes across any sea. Ilya exchanged a lullaby he had never sung aloud for bread sugared with crushed violets. Time wore a different coat in the night market, neither rushing nor dragging, but holding their hands loosely, letting them wander without losing them. But as the eastern sky began to show the faintest grey, the market started to fold its corners with a nearly audible sigh. Lanterns winked like tired eyes, and the paper lantern that had guided them drifted up to the treetops, a soft star waiting for permission to fade. They left just as the first rooster began to crow, the market already dissolving like morning mist. By the time they reached the cottage, nothing remained in the hollow but the ancient oak and the lingering scent of possibility. But in their pockets they carried proof of the night's magic, the bell that would ring for nearly honest truths, the boat that held wishes, the star salt that tasted of dreams. Ansa was waiting with warm milk and knowing smiles, as if she had been expecting their return from an adventure she had never doubted they would find. The bottle of starlight pulsed contentedly, and the listening windows creaked a gentle welcome home. They had learned something important about the value of things that couldn't be weighed or measured, about magic that existed in the spaces between sleeping and waking, between the last bell and the first crow, between one breath and the next. The weeks following their visit to the night market settled into the cottage like honey into warm bread, sweet and nourishing and unhurried. The bell from the twilight vendor found its place on the kitchen shelf, nestled between Ansa's dried herbs and a jar of honey that never seemed to empty, occasionally catching morning light in a way that made its copper surface glow like captured sunset. Rowan's presence had woven itself so naturally into their daily rhythms that even the listening windows seemed to creak more softly when he passed beneath them, as if the house itself had learned to accommodate his river-bright laughter and easy companionship. Autumn arrived with its usual quiet ceremony, painting the hills in shades of amber and rust, and with it came the first sharp breath of winter. The travelers who found their way to Ansa's door now carried a different kind of chill in their bones, not just from the weather but from something deeper, colder, like sorrow that had been left out in frost until it crystallized into something sharp enough to cut. The air itself felt thinner, more brittle, and Ilya noticed that his gift worked differently in the colder months, the grey threads of human emotion seeming to hang longer in the crisp air before dissolving into the patient sky. It was on the first truly bitter night of winter, when the moon hung like a silver coin against a sky the color of deep water, that the traveler arrived. His knock was neither hesitant like those seeking comfort, nor desperate like those seeking refuge, but something else entirely, sharp and deliberate, as if his knuckles themselves were made of winter glass. Ansa opened the door to find a man whose eyes reflected everything, but revealed nothing, pale blue and brittle, carrying winter not just in his clothes but in the very core of his being. "I've heard you offer shelter to those who need lightning," he said, his voice carrying the particular weariness of someone who'd been traveling not just through distance, but through time itself, accumulating weight with each step. As Ansa welcomed him with her usual grace, settling him by the fire with tea and one of Ilya's midnight sandwiches, the boy felt his gift stirring in ways it never had before. The grey threads that usually drifted like spider silk around visitors were different here, thicker and more substantial, swirling around the traveler like kelp in deep water. They had a greenish tint, dense and viscous, and when Ilya breathed them in, they tasted bitter and metallic, making his chest ache with unfamiliar pressure. Without thinking, he began his quiet hum, the same gentle melody that had always helped clear the air and ease the breathing of those who carried too much. But instead of dissolving, the greenish threads seemed to respond by growing denser, gathering into something that looked almost solid. The traveler's words grew more bitter as Ilya hummed, his voice taking on edges that cut through the warm kitchen air. And the very atmosphere began to feel oppressive, as if the walls were drawing closer together. Ilya hummed more intently, breathing in the swirling heaviness with deliberate purpose. But instead of transforming into something lighter as it usually did, the bitterness seemed to condense inside his chest, becoming heavier and more concentrated. The bottle of starlight on the windowsill flickered, its steady glow faltering as if struggling against a powerful current, and even Rowan stopped his whittling, sensing the palpable shift in the room's energy. The bell on the shelf gave a single clear chime, and Ilya paused, confused. The traveler hadn't said anything that sounded like nearly honest truth, yet the bell had rung with unmistakable clarity. That's when understanding dawned like winter sunrise, pale but illuminating. The greenish threads weren't meant to be cleared away, because they were the traveler's truth. His honest acknowledgement of pain that had grown too heavy to carry, but too integral to simply discard. In desperation, Ilya reached for an empty jar from Ansa's pantry, a simple glass container that had once held preserves. As the bitter threads swirled around him, dense as storm clouds, he guided them into the jar instead of into himself. The heaviness seemed almost relieved to have a proper container, settling into the glass like honey finding its level, swirling with that same greenish glow but contained now, acknowledged rather than banished. The moment the last thread entered the jar, something shifted in the traveler's posture. The sharp edges in his voice softened, and he began to speak about his actual journey, instead of the hollow version he had been offering, about losses that couldn't be fixed, but could perhaps be properly held. Ansa took the jar from Ilya's trembling hands with careful reverence, as if handling something precious rather than something difficult. She carried it to the cupboard and placed it on a high shelf, then returned with a small piece of paper. In her careful handwriting, she wrote a single word that looked like a lullaby, and underneath, "The date, if it won't be thrown away," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. "We'll learn to tend it." That night, as the cottage settled around its new secret, Ilya understood that his gift was growing in directions he hadn't expected. Sometimes healing meant creating proper containers for what belonged, honoring the weight of what people carried, instead of trying to make it disappear. The jar hummed very quietly from its shelf, and in that sound, he heard the beginning of something important. A new way of helping that acknowledged the complexity of human hearts and the truth that not all darkness was meant to be banished, but sometimes simply needed to be witnessed, contained, and given a proper place to rest. Word of the jar on the high shelf traveled the way winter stories do, wrapped in steam from evening cups and carried by careful mouths that understood the value of what couldn't be easily explained. People began arriving, not just seeking the clearing of grey threads, but something deeper, more complex. They came carrying burdens that had grown too heavy for solitary shoulders, seeking not the removal of their pain, but perhaps a proper place to set it down, to have it witnessed and held, rather than banished into the patient sky. The collection grew slowly, each jar marked with Ansa's careful handwriting and dated like entries in a diary of human resilience. Some contained threads so pale they were barely visible, whispers of old disappointments that had finally found voice. Others held storms of greenish sorrow, thick as kelp, swirling with the particular weight of grief that had learned its own name. The cupboard began to feel less like storage and more like a quiet gallery of human experience, tended with reverence and deep understanding. It was on one of those soft spring afternoons, when the air hung sweet with apple blossoms, and the listening windows creaked contentedly in the warm breeze, that the messenger arrived. He was a fisherman with hands weathered by salt and rope, eyes that held the perpetual squint of someone who spent their life scanning horizons for both promise and peril. His boots left damp prints on Ansa's kitchen floor, and he carried the particular urgency of someone bearing news that couldn't wait for proper social pleasantries. "The lighthouse has forgotten itself," he said, accepting tea with grateful hands that trembled slightly from more than just the morning's cold work. "The beam grows weaker each night, barely reaching past the rocks now. Ships are starting to avoid our harbor, and the keeper—" He paused, searching for words that could hold the weight of what he'd witnessed. "He keeps perfect records, writes everything down neat as church ledgers, but he won't speak to anyone. Just sits up there with his books and his guilt, watching the light die by degrees." Ansa's gaze found Ilya's across the kitchen, that quiet, steady look she used when the next right thing had already chosen itself. The bottle of starlight pulsed gently on its windowsill, as if responding to the mention of another light in distress. Ilya felt the small copper bell warm in his pocket, the one from the night market that rang for nearly honest truths, and knew it wanted to make this journey. The path to the headland wound through sleeping meadows, where wildflowers nodded in the salt breeze, past tide pools that reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. The lighthouse rose ahead, whitewashed and wind-bothered, its great lens turning with mechanical faithfulness, but casting only the weakest glow. Even in daylight, Ilya could sense something wrong with its rhythm, a hesitation in its steady sweep that spoke of deeper troubles than simple mechanical failure. The keeper who answered their knock was a man whose precision had become his prison. His clothes were pressed to sharp creases, his lighthouse quarters organized with the fierce order of someone fighting chaos with the only weapons available. But his eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying accuracy as a burden rather than a gift. Perfectionism worn like armor that had grown too heavy to bear. "I maintain the finest records on this coast," he said, his voice crisp as winter air, leading them up the spiral stairs that wound around the lighthouse's interior. Every ship logged, every weather pattern noted, every maintenance task completed exactly on schedule. But the light keeps dimming, and I cannot find the fault in my procedures. At the top, the great lens sat clouded not with salt spray, but with something that looked like crystallized loneliness. The keeper stood beside it with rigid posture, and when he spoke, each word was weighed before release. 3 weeks ago, during the storm, I kept perfect rotation. Every ship found safe harbor, but in the morning a sparrow lay against the glass. Just a small thing. His voice cracked like ice beginning to thaw. If I cannot protect even the smallest life within my circle of light, what use is all this precision? The bell chimed softly, recognizing the nearly honest truth beneath his words. Instead of humming immediately, Ilya did what Ansa had taught him. He offered comfort first. He spread his blanket on the lighthouse's narrow balcony and poured tea from his thermos, the cardamom scent mixing with salt air in a way that made the isolated space feel less alone. As they shared midnight sandwiches while the sun painted the sea in shades of amber and rose, Ilya began his quiet hum. But this time, instead of trying to clear the grey threads of perfectionism and guilt that clung to the keeper's shoulders, he worked to loosen them, to give them room to breathe and transform. Some of the heaviest knots dissolved entirely, but others simply became more flexible, allowing space for human fallibility within the framework of sacred duty. "You don't have to carry this alone," Ilya said gently, and the keeper's rigid posture began to soften like morning mist touched by sun. As darkness fell, the lighthouse lens began to clear, its glow returning not with harsh brightness but with warm steadiness. The light had remembered itself not through force, but through the simple recognition that purpose and perfection were not the same thing, that even the most dedicated keeper was allowed to be beautifully, imperfectly human. When they left the next morning, the beam swept across the water with renewed confidence, and the keeper walked them to the cliff's edge, with shoulders that no longer carried the weight of the entire sea. The jar in Ilya's basket remained empty, because sometimes healing meant not containing the difficult things, but giving them room to transform in place, allowing dedication to remember its original purpose as care rather than burden. The summer that followed the lighthouse healing stretched long and golden, filled with the particular contentment that comes after understanding has deepened into wisdom. Salt had threaded their hair during the cliffside visit, and a quiet steadiness rode beside them, like a second shadow as they returned to the cottage's familiar rhythms. The keeper's beam swept the morning sea with renewed warmth, and they carried the empty jar home like proof that not everything heavy needs a container, that sometimes healing means giving difficult things room to transform rather than disappear. For several weeks, the cottage breathed with deeper satisfaction. Visitors arrived and left with easier breathing, the listening windows opening of their own accord, as though they too had learned a softer way to hold light. The cupboard of jars had become a testament to complexity, honored rather than eliminated, each container marked with Ansa's careful handwriting and tended with reverence. But even the most peaceful seasons carry seeds of change, and it was on one of those drowsy August afternoons, when the air hung thick as honey and bees moved like slow commas through the clover, that the first sharp note entered their harmony. Rowan had begun sleeping more often by the river, saying the current told better stories after dark. His laughter still bubbled in the kitchen, but it carried a restless undertone, a low drum of weather coming. Ilya noticed clouds turning tart on his tongue even on blue mornings, a hint of lemons where linen should be. Some afternoons the copper bell on the shelf warmed without ringing, as if the room were holding its breath around an unasked question. The bottle of starlight pulsed with uncertain rhythm, and even the patient window seemed to creak with anticipation. The argument began small, The way forest fires start with a single spark, over something as simple as whether the approaching storm clouds looked more like sheep or sailing ships. But it grew, fed by something neither boy fully understood, until words became weapons and silence became a wall. "You make everything too comfortable," Rowan said suddenly, his moss-green eyes flashing with unusual fire. His voice carried the sharp edge of long-held frustration, finally finding voice. "People come here broken, and you smooth all their edges until they're soft as pudding. But sometimes the sharp parts are what keep them standing. Sometimes the rough bits are what make them real." The accusation hit Ilya like a physical blow, his chest tightening with hurt and confusion. "I help them breathe easier," he replied, his voice carrying a defensive edge he'd never heard in it before. "I make space for healing." "Or you make them forget what they learned from their scars," Rowan shot back, his river-bright laughter nowhere to be found. "You steal their authentic pain, make them forget the lessons their difficulties taught them." The copper bell on the kitchen shelf began to ring, its clear tone cutting through their heated words with relentless honesty. "And you," Ilya said suddenly, the words surprising them both with their bitter accuracy, "you love storms too much. You think everything needs to stay wild and painful, like comfort is somehow cheating. You romanticize suffering and mistake struggle for strength." The bell rang and rang, its tone growing more insistent, more desperate, ringing for nearly every almost. Both boys were speaking truth, but truth with edges sharp enough to draw blood. And the sound wouldn't stop, wouldn't let them retreat into safer territories of polite disagreement. They stood in the kitchen's honeyed light, two kinds of care facing each other. Rowan spoke of nights on the water, when the sky refused to be polite, when wind shouted and no one pretended not to hear, when people found their real voices. Ilya spoke of the women who came with swallowed thunder and left able to sleep, of the men who mistook armor for honesty and softened only when someone set down a plate first. The argument never raised its voice, but it raised their ribs. Ilya said he feared Rowan loved the gale more than the harbor, that stirring pain could look like courage while being only habit. Rowan said he feared Ilya loved the hush more than the heartbeat, that smoothing could become a way of stepping back from the living edge. Ansa listened like a field listens to rain, refilling their cups and setting sliced pears between them, letting the room feel their difference without trying to braid it too quickly. When she finally spoke, her voice was a soft road. She said that truth has many weathers and mercy many temperatures, but the bell would not stop its relentless witness. By twilight they were emptied of sentences. Rowan wrapped his fingers around the mended oar as if testing its balance, then set it down again with care, as though realizing that leaving requires a different instrument. He kissed Ansa's cheek, held Ilya's gaze for a long, quiet beat, and said he needed the river's truth for a while. No slammed doors, no theatrical silence. Just the sound of a friend trusting distance to teach what proximity could not. He walked toward the path with shoulders uncertain but lifted, and the bell at last fell quiet, its lesson delivered. The cottage held the space he left like a palm warming an old coin. The absence stretched between them like a long, empty hallway, and Ilya discovered that his hum couldn't smooth this particular roughness, that some distances must be walked, not sung across. Night stretched long and kind, and the bottle on the sill glowed a thoughtful green, the color it wore when acceptance was harder won. In the hush, he sensed space widening, a place where understanding might someday return, changed but not broken. The weeks that followed Rowan's departure settled into the cottage like honey finding its way into warm bread, sweet but changed in essential texture. The empty chair by the hearth held his shape the way riverbanks hold the memory of spring floods, and Ilya learned to sit with that outline without trying to fill it too quickly. The listening windows still creaked their gentle welcomes, but they seemed more attentive now, as if compensating for the absence of river-bright laughter that once filled the spaces between words. Ilya continued his quiet work with visitors, but he noticed a new caution threading through his chest, a gentle hand on the reins of his gift. The copper bell's insistent honesty had taught him something about the difference between healing and helping, between clearing away difficulty and simply making room for it to breathe. Some sharp edges, he was learning, wanted steady company rather than sanding smooth. The bottle of starlight pulsed with deeper hues as autumn painted the hills in amber and rust, its glow taking on the contemplative quality of someone who had witnessed an important argument and was still processing its lessons. The cupboard of jars had grown into something that felt less like storage and more like a quiet gallery of human complexity. Each container marked with Ansa's careful handwriting and tended with reverence. It was on one of those soft autumn mornings, when mist clung to the hills like forgotten prayers and the air tasted of apples and coming frost, that the small voice reached them. Not quite a knock, more like a whisper against wood, so gentle that even the listening windows had to strain to hear. When Ansa opened the door, she found a child standing on the threshold like a question mark made flesh. The girl couldn't have been more than 7, all knees and wonder, with hair the color of dandelion fluff and eyes that held the bright stillness of someone who had learned to see more than most people thought necessary. Her feet were bare despite the morning chill, and her dress was clean but worn, mended with the kind of careful stitches that spoke of love measured in small, precise repairs. "I've come to learn the listening craft," she announced, her voice carrying the musical quality of someone who had spent long hours in conversation with silence. "My grandmother sent me. She said you might have room for someone who wants to learn how to help heavy things find their proper places." The bottle of starlight pulsed once, warm and welcoming, and the kitchen windows eased open just an inch, letting in the scent of clover and morning dew. Ansa's smile was like sunrise touching frost, transformative and gentle. "What's your name, little one?" "Mina," the child replied, and the name felt like a small bell ringing in the cottage's peaceful atmosphere. "And I walk light because the ground has memories." Over the following days, Mina revealed herself to be a natural student of the gentle arts. Ilya found himself in the unexpected role of teacher, showing her what Ansa had taught him through patient observation rather than formal lessons. He demonstrated how to warm a room before asking it for anything, how to offer blankets before questions, how to understand that trust grows in the soil of safety rather than urgency. "First," he would say, echoing Ansa's wisdom while discovering his own, "you must give a place your presence, your gentle attention, before you expect it to reveal its secrets." Mina absorbed everything with the eager stillness of someone who understood that learning was less about acquiring knowledge and more about developing the capacity to hold what others could not yet bear to hold alone. When visitors arrived carrying their grey threads and heavy hearts, she would settle quietly in the corner, watching with eyes that missed nothing but judged less. It was during one of those drowsy afternoons, when the fire crackled contentedly and the first winter wind rattled the windows, that Mina approached the cupboard of jars with curious fingers. She traced the careful script of Ansa's labels, her expression thoughtful. "These feel like stories," she said softly. "Not bad stories, just heavy ones that got tired of being carried." Ilya nodded, recognizing the truth in her observation. "They're the things people couldn't carry anymore, but also couldn't throw away. Ansa says we tend them here." Mina reached for one of the older jars, its contents swirling with that familiar greenish density. "Can we open one?" she asked, her voice filled with fearless curiosity, just to let it breathe a little. Together they carefully unsealed the lid. A faint mist rose from the jar, carrying the scent of old disappointments and courage that had grown weary. But instead of recoiling, Mina breathed deeply, her bare feet planted firmly on the wooden floor. "It smells like hope that forgot how to hope," she murmured, "and a little bit like strength that needed a rest." As they sat with the opened jar, something unexpected happened. The mist didn't dissipate into grey threads to be cleared away, but settled into the room itself, adding a new layer to its familiar scent of cardamom and rain. Along the inside of the glass, where the dense swirl had been, a faint luminescence began to appear, soft and patient as fireflies in summer twilight. The bitterness had transformed, no longer sharp and heavy, but glowing with quiet dignity, a testament to what could become when given breath and story and witness. The jar stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a garden where even the most difficult emotions could find their own kind of bloom. Ansa, watching from her rocking chair, smiled with eyes that held the warmth of countless sunsets. "See?" she said gently. "Bitterness given breath and story can turn luminous along the edges. What once felt heavy can feed new roots." In the days that followed, they opened jars one at a time, not to empty them, but to give their contents air and acknowledgement. They discovered that pain, when witnessed with patience rather than urgency, could develop edges that caught light like morning frost touched by sun. The cupboard began to feel less like a collection of burdens and more like a library of transformations, each container a chapter in the ongoing story of how hearts learn to hold what they cannot release. Winter settled around them with gentle authority, and though Rowan's absence still created its own particular silence, the cottage had found new music in the sound of Mina's quiet questions and careful observations. She brought her own gifts to their work, an intuitive understanding of how to tend difficult things without trying to change them too quickly, how to offer presence without demanding transformation. The bottle of starlight glowed with renewed warmth on its windowsill, and the listening windows opened more readily when Mina passed beneath them, as if recognizing a kindred spirit in this small person who walked lightly because she understood that the ground held memories, and who approached even the heaviest jars with bare feet and an open heart, ready to learn the endless variations of how to hold what hurts until it remembers how to shine. Winter deepened around their newfound rhythm like a gentle hand settling over sleeping earth, and with it came a transformation that neither Ilya nor Mina had anticipated. The cottage breathed with deeper satisfaction now, each room holding the memory of pain transformed rather than simply cleared away. The cupboard of jars glowed with soft inner light, testament to burdens that had learned to shine when given proper witness and care. The town began bringing their midnights to Ilya's kitchen, though they didn't call them that at first. They arrived carrying insomnia like an unwelcome companion, bringing their 3 o'clock worries and 4 o'clock regrets, seeking not dramatic healing, but simple comfort. The knock would come soft and respectful after the church bells had long since fallen silent, and Ansa's lamp would bloom like a small moon above the kitchen table. It began with Mrs. Chen, the baker's widow, who appeared one February night with flour still dusting her apron and exhaustion weighing her shoulders like a heavy shawl. "I keep waking at 2, she said, accepting tea with grateful hands that trembled from more than cold. "The house feels too quiet without his snoring, and I find myself making bread at hours when no one should be awake." Ilya, now grown into his gift with the steady confidence of someone who had learned to trust his deepest instincts, began what would become his signature offering. He moved through the kitchen with practiced grace, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Thick slices of bread toasted until golden, butter spread while still soft enough to melt into every pore. A thin layer of honey from Ansa's hives, sometimes jam if the season was right, but always applied with the kind of attention that said, "You matter. You are welcome here. You are safe." The ritual carried weight beyond its simple ingredients. As Ilya prepared each midnight sandwich, his quiet hum filled the kitchen, not trying to heal or transform anything, but simply creating space where someone could sit with their sleeplessness without shame. Each sandwich was made as if it were the most important task in the world, butter applied with careful generosity, honey drizzled in patterns that caught the firelight like tiny golden webs, and when the visitor had eaten, when the sharp edges of their midnight had softened into something more bearable, Ilya would offer the phrase that seemed to arrive on his tongue as naturally as breath itself. "You can set that down for a while." Not an instruction to forget, nor a command to discard, but an invitation to respite, a promise that the world would not collapse if they simply allowed themselves a moment's rest from the relentless task of carrying. Mrs. Chen ate 3 sandwiches that first night, and when she left, her shoulders no longer held the rigid set of someone bracing against invisible weight. Word spread in the way good news travels through small communities, quietly and surely. Carried on the breath of those who had found unexpected comfort, they came with broken hearts and empty stomachs, with secrets too heavy to carry alone, and dreams too fragile to speak aloud. A young father whose newborn refused to sleep, an elderly man whose memories visited at inconvenient hours, a teacher who graded papers until dawn because silence felt too much like failure. The cottage responded by becoming more itself, windows opening more readily, the hearth burning steadier, even the floorboards creaking more gently to announce visitors without startling them. Mina proved to be a natural companion to these midnight hours, her bare feet silent on wooden floors as she helped prepare sandwich after sandwich. She learned to read the particular hunger that comes with sleeplessness, understanding that sometimes people needed thick comfort and other times required delicate sustenance. Her small hands became skilled at spreading butter with just the right pressure, at offering blankets before questions, presents before solutions. By spring, Their kitchen had transformed into something that felt less like a room and more like a sanctuary for the restless hours. The copper bell had learned to ring more softly, recognizing that midnight truths required gentler handling. The bottle of starlight glowed with steady contentment, its light reflecting off empty jam jars pressed into service for the endless supply of comfort food. It was during one of these drowsy pre-dawn hours, when the kitchen hummed with quiet conversations and the comfortable sounds of people finding peace together, that Ilya looked up from the cutting board to see a familiar figure silhouetted in the doorway. Rowan stood there, travel-worn and softer around the edges, his moss-green eyes taking in the scene with something that looked like wonder, mixed with recognition. He didn't announce himself or offer explanations for his absence. Instead, he simply settled into the chair that had been waiting by the hearth, as if he'd never left, as if the months of distance had been nothing more than a long breath finally released. "I've been thinking about storms and harbors," he said quietly, his voice carrying new depths like water that had traveled far and learned many songs, about how they're not opposites but partners in the same dance. Someone passed him tea without being asked, and he accepted it with grateful grace. Ilya reached for bread, and Rowan reached for honey, their movements finding the old rhythm as naturally as rivers finding the sea. They ate in comfortable silence, while the kitchen continued its gentle midnight work around them. Visitors sharing sandwiches and stories, finding comfort in the simple act of being awake together when the world slept. The cottage breathed around them all, holding their reunion without fanfare, simply expanding to accommodate the return of its missing piece. Though they still disagreed sometimes, their differences now felt like two oars finding the same river's rhythm, each stroke unique, but propelling them forward together. The bottle of starlight pulsed with quiet approval, and somewhere in the distance, the first birds began their tentative morning songs. But inside, the midnight continued its gentle work, proving once again that some of the most important healing happens not in dramatic moments of crisis, but in quiet hours when people gather to share bread and presents, creating warmth that reaches far beyond any single hearth. The nights that followed Rowan's return settled into the cottage like honey, finding its way into warm bread, sweet and changed in essential texture. The midnight sandwich ritual had grown into something larger than any of them had expected, a gentle tide that ebbed and flowed through the town's sleepless hours. Visitors came not just seeking comfort, but bringing their own small offerings, sharing stories and lullabies that wove themselves into the cottage's growing tapestry of communal healing. It was Mina who first spoke the idea that had been growing in the spaces between their quiet conversations. She was drying dishes with her usual deliberate care, bare feet planted firmly on the wooden floor, when she looked up with eyes that held the bright certainty of someone who had discovered something important. "What if we brought everyone together?" she said softly, her voice carrying the musical quality of water over stones. Not to fix anything or celebrate loudly, but just to breathe in the same space. To let people see that they're not alone with their midnight thoughts. The bottle of starlight pulsed once from its windowsill, as if approving of the suggestion, and Ansa's smile bloomed like sunrise touching frost. "A gentle festival," she murmured, her cardamom-scented presence filling the kitchen with warmth. No fireworks or spectacle, just lanterns and lullabies, sandwiches and listening. Word spread through the town the way good news travels quietly and surely, carried on the breath of those who had found unexpected comfort in the cottage's midnight hours. The lighthouse keeper offered to polish old lantern glass, his steady hands finding purpose in preparing light for others. Mrs. Chen began baking loaves that tasted faintly of orange peel and memory, each one shaped with the care she usually reserved for her most precious recipes. Children appeared at doorsteps with rice paper and dried flowers, their small fingers learning to craft lanterns that would bob like drowsy fireflies in the evening breeze. The fisherman's wife taught anyone who asked how to fold paper into shapes that caught light gently, creating moons and stars and tiny boats that seemed to glow from within. As the evening of the festival approached, Ilya and Mina stood before their cupboard of jars, considering the soft luminescence that had developed along their edges. The containers that had once held only heaviness now pulsed with gentle light, proof that even the most difficult emotions could learn to shine when given proper witness and care. "We could let them participate," Ilya said, touching one lid with reverent fingers. "Not to empty them, but to let their light join the celebration. Together, They carefully selected a dozen of the most luminous jars, wrapping each one in soft cloth, as if handling something precious and fragile. These would become walkways of light, gentle beacons that would guide people through the meadow while honoring the transformation that had occurred within their glass walls. The festival began as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose. People arrived at the meadow below the cottage, carrying their paper lanterns like gentle prayers made visible, each one flickering with warm candlelight that never wavered. There was no stage, no formal program, just the natural gathering of a community that had learned to trust the wisdom of quiet moments. Ilya, Mina, Rowan and Ansa moved through the crowd like gentle shepherds, placing the glowing jars along pathways and beneath trees, creating constellations at ground level that rivaled the stars above. Each jar cast a soft radius of understanding, transforming what had once been burdens into sources of warmth and illumination. The sharing began organically, without announcement or invitation. Someone hummed a lullaby their grandmother had sung, and others joined with harmonies that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Stories were exchanged like gifts, not dramatic tales but quiet acknowledgments of midnight courage and 3 o'clock wisdom, of the particular strength it takes to admit vulnerability and accept help. The lighthouse keeper spoke of learning to tend duty without drowning in perfection, his words carrying the weight of hard-won understanding. Mrs. Chen shared how midnight sandwiches had taught her that grief could be nourishing rather than depleting when witnessed by patient hearts. A young father admitted that sleepless nights with his newborn had become opportunities for wonder rather than endurance, and several people nodded with recognition. Children moved between the lanterns with unconscious joy, their laughter weaving through adult conversations like silver thread through dark fabric. Elderly couples sat on blankets, holding hands and watching the lights with eyes that remembered other gatherings, but recognized something uniquely precious in this gentle communion. As the night deepened, the lanterns seemed to pulse in rhythm with something larger than themselves, creating a living constellation that breathed with the collective heartbeat of the community. The festival had become exactly what it needed to be, not entertainment or spectacle, but recognition of the quiet courage it takes to face darkness with open hearts. The town didn't applaud when stories ended. Instead, they sighed in collective relief, the sound of people recognizing their own experiences reflected in others' words. Even the sky seemed to participate, offering its clearest stars and a moon that hung like a silver benediction over the gathering. Near midnight, as the lanterns continued their gentle dance and the jars glowed with steady contentment, Ilya understood that this gathering was not an ending, but a beginning. The festival would be remembered not for its beauty, but for its gentleness, for the way it honored both darkness and light as necessary partners in the ongoing dance of human experience. When people finally began gathering their lanterns and preparing for home, they moved with the unhurried grace of those who had been truly seen and heard. The meadow exhaled with them, a long, grateful sigh that seemed to loosen a knot the town hadn't realized it had been carrying, proving once again that sometimes the most profound celebrations are simply opportunities to rest in one another's presence until hearts remember their easiest rhythm. The gentle festival's magic settled into the cottage walls like morning mist finding its home, sweet and transformative. In the weeks that followed, visitors spoke of how the lanterns had pulsed with collective heartbeats, how shared stories had woven invisible threads connecting midnight courage to dawn wisdom. The meadow itself held the memory, wildflowers growing more vibrantly where the jars had cast their soft light, as if the earth had absorbed some of the healing that occurred above its patient surface. Autumn deepened around their renewed harmony with the familiar ceremony of amber light and cooling air. But this year carried an undertone that made Ilya's chest tighten with unnamed recognition. Ansa moved through her daily routines with the same gentle grace, her cardamom-scented presence filling the cottage with warmth. But something in her movements had grown more deliberate. Like a tide that knows its shoreline and approaches it with quiet reverence, the changes came slowly, noticed first in small details that only love would catch. Her robust cardamom scent began to soften, replaced gradually by something gentler, like dried lavender mixed with the memory of rain. Her steps grew lighter on the wooden floors, almost soundless, as if she were learning to walk between worlds. The listening windows still creaked their welcomes, but they seemed to lean closer when she passed, as though trying to memorize the sound of her breathing. Mina, with her bare feet and intuitive wisdom, began tending the fire with increased attention, coaxing steady warmth from wood, as if asking rather than commanding. Rowan fixed hinges and tightened loose knobs without being asked, his easy muttering making ordinary repairs sound like lullabies. Ilya found himself moving more slowly by choice, giving every shared task the ceremony it deserved, slicing bread with the patience of someone who understands that crust and crumb hold conversations worth honoring. The bottle of starlight pulsed with deeper hues as the season progressed, its glow taking on the contemplative quality of something bearing witness to important transformations. Even the copper bell seemed to warm more readily, as if preparing for truths that needed gentle handling. It was on one of those soft October afternoons, when the air hung thick with apple scent and the promise of early frost, that Ansa called Ilya to her rocking chair by the kitchen window. The bottle cast patterns of green and gold across her weathered hands as she reached into her apron pocket and withdrew something that made his breath catch. An envelope, aged to the color of cream and sealed with what looked like captured starlight, the same ethereal substance that had filled his arrival bottle so many years ago. The paper felt warm beneath his fingers, alive with patient energy that hummed in harmony with his own gift. "I wrote this when you were small," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years and the lightness of relief finally arriving. "When I first began to understand that the promises we make in love are not about holding on, but about tending what grows even when it means learning to let go." The seal warmed his fingertips, then released with a soft sigh, as if it had been waiting all these years for his touch. The listening windows opened another inch, the house itself leaning closer to witness this moment of revelation. The letter unfolded like a flower, blooming in gentle motion, revealing Ansa's careful handwriting, interwoven with threads of that same ethereal light. As Ilya read, the words seemed to glow faintly, as if the ink itself remembered the starlight that had brought him to their doorstep. "My bright found boy." The letter began, "You came on the kind of night that teaches clocks to be quiet." The station grew out of fog like a breath finally taken, and there you were, fist wrapped around light, as if the night had asked you to keep it safe. I made a vow beside that bench to guard what I did not understand, to tend what I could not fully comprehend. I have kept it as well as my hands could manage, but understand this truth I couldn't speak aloud then, a truth that took me many seasons to learn while watching you work your quiet magic. Love is not detox, my dear one. It is compost. What once felt heavy can feed new roots. The grey threads you've learned to tend, the jars we've filled with honored darkness, the midnight sandwiches that carry more than sustenance, all of it is the rich soil from which wisdom grows. Your gift has never been to make pain disappear, but to help it find its proper place in the larger garden of living. You have taught this old house and this old woman that healing isn't about burning away the difficult parts, but about creating conditions where they can transform into something that nourishes rather than depletes. The letter continued, speaking of small truths with large echoes, how to tell the difference between silence that heals and silence that hides, how to place comfort before questions, how to let someone keep their essential thorns if those sharp edges connect them to their own life. It named Rowan without using his name, describing the friend who would love weather and teach the house to breathe wider. It made space for a child with bare feet who would see what adults forget. Near the end, her script grew more tender, as if the ink had learned to whisper, "There will come a day when I am more window than wall, more breeze than body. Do not try to keep the air out. Open everything that wants opening. The light you carried here belongs neither to me nor to you. It belongs to the night we are all part of. If you need me, listen by the rails on a still evening or stir a pot and taste cardamom. I am not gone from those places." Ilya folded the letter with reverent care, pressing it to his chest where it pulsed with the same rhythm as his own heartbeat. The copper bell offered a single delicate tone, not to correct but to bless this moment of understanding. That evening, as the cottage settled into its familiar rhythm and the first winter stars appeared like scattered promises, Ilya sat beside her rocking chair and held her hand like a lantern's handle. Ansa's breathing grew softer and softer, matching the cottage's own gentle sighs, until it became indistinguishable from the house's patient exhalations. When morning arrived, painted in shades of pearl and rose, Ansa had become part of the light that lived in the walls themselves. Her physical presence had dissolved like morning mist, but her essence had woven itself so thoroughly into the cottage's atmosphere that every creak of the listening windows, every warm glow from the bottle on the sill, every comfortable silence that settled around midnight visitors carried her cardamom-scented wisdom. Grief visited like low tide, patient and inevitable, but it brought with it the recognition that some transformations are too gentle to be called endings. Mina found him there as dawn painted the kitchen in honey and hope, her bare feet silent on floors that somehow felt warmer. She sat beside him without words, understanding that presence was the only gift large enough for such moments. The cottage breathed around them, holding their sorrow with the same patient grace it had always shown, and in the gentle creak of settling timber, they could hear Ansa's voice whispering the wisdom that would guide them forward, that love becomes compost, feeding new growth, and that the most precious gifts are those that teach us how to tend what we cannot keep, until it learns to shine with its own enduring light. Grief moved through the cottage like low tide, patient and inevitable, touching every familiar surface and leaving behind the particular weight of love that has nowhere left to pour itself except into memory. The days following Ansa's gentle transformation stretched long and quiet, filled with the sound of three people learning to breathe in a space that had grown both emptier and somehow more full, as if her cardamom-scented essence had woven itself so thoroughly into the walls that every creak and sigh carried her wisdom forward. Ilya found himself reaching for the familiar rhythms of midnight sandwiches and listening windows, but his hands moved differently now, carrying the restless energy of someone whose gift had suddenly become both burden and lifeline. The visitors still came, drawn by the cottage's reputation for gentle healing, but they arrived to find a young man whose grief had sharpened his instincts in ways that surprised even him. Where once he had hummed to clear grey threads with patient grace, now he felt the urgent pull to gather every trace of bitterness from the air, to empty every jar at once, to make the world shine with immaculate light. The urge was fierce and familiar, this desire to be useful in his sorrow, to prove that Ansa's teachings hadn't died with her physical presence. When the baker's apprentice arrived with scraped palms and tears of frustration, Ilya's hum began automatically, pulling the sharp threads of anger with more force than gentleness. The copper bell warmed without ringing, and something in its silent heat made him pause. Mina watched from her corner, with eyes that held the bright stillness of someone who had learned to see what adults often missed. Her bare feet found the wooden floor with deliberate care as she approached, placing one small hand over his with the gentle authority of someone carrying forward a sacred trust. Ansa said love is compost, she reminded him, her voice soft as falling leaves. Not detox. What if we just let it breathe for a while? Her words were a gentle anchor, holding him against the current of his own desperate need to fix and clear and make everything easier. They stirred the memory of Ansa's letter, that careful script speaking of gardens and growth, of creating conditions rather than forcing change. The bottle of starlight pulsed once from its windowsill, as if agreeing with her quiet wisdom. The next morning brought them to the sea, following paths through autumn meadows where wildflowers nodded in the salt breeze. Ilya carried a basket, filled with some of the older jars from the cupboard, their contents still swirling with that dense greenish sorrow that had not yet found its transformation. The weight felt different now, not like burdens to be eliminated, but like stories waiting for the right kind of witness. The sea stretched before them like a vast, breathing presence, its surface catching morning light and holding it gently before releasing it back to the sky. Waves rolled against the shore with the eternal rhythm of something that had learned patience through centuries of practice, and scattered along the tide line were shells that gleamed faintly in the light, each one holding the particular warmth of unspoken words that had finally found their way to shore. Without discussion, Ilya waded into the shallow water, the cold shocking his ankles into full presence. One by one, he placed the jars on the incoming tide, watching as the waves embraced them with neither urgency nor rejection. They didn't sink or shatter. Instead, buoyed by the subtle light within them, by the stories they held, they began to drift and glow like small moons finding their rhythm with something larger than themselves. Some jars drifted further out, becoming tiny beacons on the vast expanse of water. Others were carried back to shore by thoughtful currents, returning to rest on the sand with their contents softened at the edges, transformed not by force but by space and movement, and the patient witness of something that had learned to hold all things without drowning them. As he watched their gentle dance, understanding settled over Ilya like morning mist finding its home. Truth wasn't poison when it had room to breathe. The bitterness, the sorrow, the difficult parts of human experience didn't need to be banished or even entirely transformed. Sometimes they just needed space, a gentle current to carry them, a patient witness to honor their journey without demanding they become something else. She knew, Rowan said softly, his voice carrying the particular gentleness he reserved for important recognitions. She knew you'd need to see this, to understand that letting go doesn't mean forgetting or failing. They walked back through the meadows as the sun painted the cottage's windows gold, their steps lighter despite the weight of what they had witnessed. In the days that followed, Ilya began teaching others what he was still learning himself, how to make space for difficult emotions without trying to eliminate them, how to offer presence without demanding transformation, how to trust that what is tended with love continues to grow even when we can't see the roots anymore. The lighthouse keeper came down from his tower more often, his ledgers growing messier but more honest. Mrs. Chen began hosting quiet gatherings where people shared bread and stories, learning that community could hold what individual hearts found too heavy to carry alone. Mina led children through night markets and morning meadows, teaching them that wonder was a practice rather than an accident. As winter settled around the cottage, with its familiar ceremony of shortened days and longer nights, the bottle of starlight glowed green-gold on windless evenings, remembering its first breath while pulsing with the rhythm of something that had learned to share its light without diminishing. Legacy drifted in simple acts, in someone refilling the kettle or opening a window, in the quiet recognition that healing was not about making darkness disappear, but about creating conditions where even the heaviest truths could learn to shine with their own patient, enduring radiance. The wisdom learned beside the patient sea wove itself into the cottage's daily rhythms like morning mist, finding its home in familiar corners. In the weeks that followed their return from the shoreline, where jars had drifted and glowed like small moons, learning their place in larger tides, something fundamental had shifted in how healing moved through their small community. The desperate urgency that had gripped Ilya after Ansa's transformation had softened into something more sustainable, more generous, like a river that had learned to carry both storm and calm with equal grace. Visitors still came seeking the cottage's gentle sanctuary, but they arrived to find something unexpected, a community that had begun teaching itself. Rowan, whose river-bright wisdom had deepened through seasons of watching weather and learning patience, started showing others how to find their own quiet melodies, not Ilya's particular hum, but the songs that lived in their own chests without needing to be learned, the rhythms that helped them navigate their personal storms without drowning in them. Everyone has their own river song, he would say, his moss-green eyes warm with understanding. You just have to sit still enough to hear it. He taught them to toast bread with intention rather than habit, to spread butter like an act of welcome, to recognize that the simple offering of sustenance could carry the weight of profound care when done with proper attention. The lighthouse keeper descended from his tower more frequently now, his ledgers transformed from instruments of rigid precision into something more alive and honest. His records still noted every ship and weather pattern, but now they included observations about the particular quality of moonlight on foggy nights, the way certain stars seemed to pulse with encouragement, the small acts of courage he witnessed from his elevated perch. He began teaching others about the difference between accuracy and perfection, showing them how to maintain essential duties while leaving room for beautiful imperfection. A light that never wavers, he explained to a small circle gathered in his quarters, is not as useful as one that responds to conditions. That grows brighter when the need is greatest and gentler when the night is already kind. His beacon had learned this lesson, pulsing with warm steadiness that ships recognized as more welcoming than mere efficiency. Mina, growing taller but still walking barefoot through the world's memories, had become a natural guide for the next generation. She led children through the night market when it appeared on windless evenings, teaching them to barter with presence rather than possessions, to listen for the subtle honesty in whispered promises, to trust the wisdom of things that couldn't be weighed or measured. From these expeditions they returned with small copper bells that chimed not for confession, but for gratitude, creating a gentle percussion of recognition that drifted through the town at unexpected moments. The midnight sandwich ritual had evolved beyond the cottage's kitchen into something the entire community practiced. Small circles formed in living rooms and back gardens, on docks where fishermen mended nets, and in fields where farmers paused between tasks. Someone would place a jar in the center, sometimes empty, sometimes holding the faintest trace of old disappointment, and everyone would sit close without crowding, learning to sense the difference between what needed air and what needed tending. These gatherings carried no formal structure, no announced leadership. They grew organically from the recognition that healing was not something to be received passively, but practiced actively, a skill that could be learned and shared like any other craft. The cottage had become less a destination for desperate seekers and more a teaching center where people discovered their own capacity for tending what hurt until it remembered how to shine. As autumn painted the hills in familiar shades of amber and rust, Ilya found himself walking the path that led to the field where the fog-silver platform sometimes appeared. He carried with him an empty jar, clear as morning water and open to whatever might need containing. The evening air held that particular stillness that made whispers travel, and something in the quality of light suggested that tonight was different, charged with the possibility of return. The platform materialized as gently as breath joining the body, its weathered timber emerging from the space between sleeping and waking. The rails hummed their ancient song, that same low, sweet note that had welcomed him into the world so many years ago. But now he understood it differently, recognized it as the sound of something that had learned to hold beginnings and transformations with equal grace, to witness arrivals and departures without trying to control their timing or direction. He sat on the familiar bench where Ansa had first discovered him, feeling the wood warm beneath him, as if recognizing an old friend. The empty jar rested in his hands like a promise, its clear glass reflecting the soft glow of the platform's patient lamps. This was not a container for bitterness or sorrow, but an offering to possibility itself, a space waiting to be filled with whatever new truths might emerge, whatever gentle transformations were yet to unfold. As he placed the jar carefully on the bench beside him, the rails exhaled a long, contented sigh that seemed to travel through iron and earth, through bone and breath. The fog began to thicken at the edges, and in its silver embrace, Ilya heard something new in the platform's ancient song, a harmony that seemed to include his own voice, Rowan's laughter, Mina's quiet wisdom, and underneath it all the cardamom-scented memory of Ansa's love, still nourishing new growth long after her physical presence had transformed into something more essential. The night held them all in its patient embrace, the cottage glowing like a gentle beacon in the distance, its windows warm with the light of people learning to carry their stories with dignity rather than shame. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new opportunities to practice the endless variations of how to hold what hurts until it remembers how to shine. But tonight, in the space between one breath and the next, everything was exactly as it needed to be, poised on the edge of whatever beautiful transformation was yet to come. The bottle of starlight pulsed green gold on its distant windowsill, remembering its first breath while promising that the best stories were still being written, still finding their way to shore like shells that gleam with unspoken words finally ready to be heard. In the final gentling of a life well tended, Ilya sat at his kitchen table, on an evening when the wind had forgotten to move, and the bottle of starlight glowed with the contemplative green gold that meant memories were stirring. He was older now, but not old, his hands still capable of slicing bread with intention, his quiet hum still weaving through the cottage's familiar atmosphere, like a lullaby that had learned to sing itself. The years had moved like seasons learning their names, each one adding depth to the cottage's gentle reputation, while carrying forward the wisdom that had grown from midnight sandwiches and patient listening. The house breathed around him with the contentment of a place that had found its truest purpose, windows creaking soft welcomes to the evening air, floorboards holding the worn paths of countless feet that had sought comfort and found transformation. The town had settled like a blanket on cooling shoulders, its rhythms now encompassing the lessons learned in this small listening house. No longer did people arrive solely as desperate seekers, but as fellow tenders of the human heart. The midnight sandwich ritual had become a beloved tradition, flowing through the community's sleepless hours like a gentle current. Someone would appear at a door with thick bread and patient presence, and the recipient would know they were being offered more than food. They were being given permission to set down their burdens, to breathe without performing strength. Rowan, his hair now threaded with silver like moonlight on water, had built himself a small house by the river, close enough to hear the cottage's midnight conversations, but far enough to maintain his own rhythm with the water's endless songs. His laughter still bubbled up like spring water, but it carried the quiet certainty of someone who understood that storms and harbors were partners in the same dance. He taught others how to find their own river songs, how to sit with the wild beauty of their emotions without seeking to smooth them away too quickly. Mina, no longer a child but a woman whose eyes held the bright stillness of someone who saw the world with profound clarity, moved through the community with bare feet that still read the ground's memories. She had become the town's keeper of quiet festivals, organizing gatherings that appeared like wildflowers, unplanned but perfectly timed, where people shared not their accomplishments but their small acts of daily courage. The copper bells she had brought back from the night market now chimed not for judgment but for gratitude, their gentle peals scattering through the air like blessings. The lighthouse keeper descended from his tower regularly now, his ledgers transformed from instruments of rigid precision into something more alive and honest. His beams swept the water with renewed warmth, and ships recognized its welcome as something deeper than mere navigation. He taught others about the difference between accuracy and perfection, showing them how to maintain essential duties while leaving room for beautiful imperfection. The cupboard of jars had become a quiet gallery of human complexity, each container marked with Ansa's careful handwriting and glowing with soft inner luminescence. These were no longer burdens to be discarded, but threads woven into the rich tapestry of shared life, reminders that what once felt heavy could feed new roots. The community had learned that the difficult parts of life were not meant for banishment, but for tending, for transformation, for finding their proper place in the grand design of being human. Ilya continued his quiet work, but he no longer felt the urgent pull to clear every trace of greyness from the air. Instead, he met each arrival with open hands and an open heart, offering not solutions but companionship for the journey. He toasted bread as Ansa had taught him, butter first, then patience, and learned to say, "You can set that down for a while," meaning it completely, knowing that the greatest kindness was often simply holding space for another's weight without demanding they release it. The bottle of starlight, his origin and quiet companion through all the seasons, still lived on the windowsill. It glowed green-gold on windless evenings, remembering its first breath, remembering the fog-silver platform, remembering the promise it held. It had dimmed slightly over the years, not from loss but from sharing. Its light diffused into the very fabric of the cottage, into the hearts of the people who gathered there. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the windows with familiar amber light, and the first stars appeared like scattered promises, Ilya found himself humming the same quiet melody that had always lived in his chest. But now it carried harmonies he hadn't noticed before, Rowan's river songs, Mina's barefoot wisdom, the lighthouse keeper's steady rhythm, the collective breath of a community that had learned to tend its shadows until they remembered how to shine. He looked outward at the familiar hills painted in evening light, and inward at the quiet landscape of his own heart. He didn't try to fix the night anymore. He kept it company. His life had become exactly what it needed to be, a long, soft practice of turning sting into shine, of creating space where difficult things could transform at their own pace. Legacy drifted in simple acts, someone refilling the kettle, opening a window, admitting what they'd carried. And the final kindness was easy. He looked outward and inward at once, letting it all be, like stars resting in their own quiet light. The cottage held them all in its patient embrace, proving once again that some kinds of magic are simply the patient practice of love, made visible in the smallest, most essential acts. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.